We're now going to transition to our plenary panel, which is entitled Resilience: How Can Our Cities and Businesses Adapt to Climate Change? I want to invite Catherine Hayhoe and James Buchanan back to the stage. They're going to be joined by Eric Friedlander, Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Louisville, and Grant Irvin, Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Pittsburgh. You know, when we look for examples of resilience being practiced at an urban level, Cincinnati among we really need to look at Midwestern cities, because Midwestern cities are the ones that are facing circumstances very similar to what we here in Cincinnati are facing. And while Cincinnati is one of the leaders among Midwestern cities, we know we have peers that are doing great work that we look to for examples of best practices that we can borrow at the same time that they're looking to us for best practices to borrow. And that interchange among the cities is really helpful to all of us, helps us move forward faster by having successful examples in other cities that we can pattern off of and use to highlight the opportunities. So James, Catherine, Eric, Grant, please come on up and yeah.
Big chair, any chair? Yeah.
Thank you, Larry. Everybody enjoy lunch? Good. And again, thanks to everybody for coming out to this. Again, we work hard on putting this together, and it really means not only a lot to us as the organizers, but I think it means a lot to this community to have this many people and this diverse group committed to the kinds of challenges that we're all faced with trying to move our city into being a kind of model of sustainability. So again, thanks to all of you all for being here. Let me introduce the panelists. I'm not going to introduce Catherine again, but if you'll do Texas text 37602, we'll see if you like her or what's the first word that comes to your mind when you think. We'll put that up on the screen in just a So Grant Irvin, who is the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Director of the Department of Planning for the City of Pittsburgh. Grant oversees the integration of sustainability and resilience into the city services, programs, and policy. He serves as an integrator of the city's activities by working across departments, agencies, and sectors. He brings deep experience intersecting the worlds of environment, community, and economic development, and infrastructure policy to create innovative and sustainable solutions for local government, community development organizations, and state agencies. Eric Friedlander was appointed to be the Chief Resilience Officer in 2017 in Louisville. In his role, Eric leads the city's efforts to help prepare for, withstand, and bounce back from chronic stresses and acute shocks. He serves as a key leader in helping city government break down existing barriers at the local level, account for pre-existing plans, and create partnerships, alliances, and financing mechanisms that will address the resilience vulnerabilities of all city residents with particular focus on human resilience. So where I want to start with this is that I this morning, when in my opening comments, I gave some general definitions for resilience, and even drew from the Rockefeller 100 Cities Resilience Program in terms of the way they describe it. The good part of that is we get some meaning for resilience. The bad part of that is that it's so general, it's almost meaningless. It could apply to anything from, as I said, the psychological dimension to an ecosystem to the socio-ecological things. The federal guidelines that focus on resilience, which came from a kind of collaboration of the 100 resilient cities, of which there are really only 98, I think. I don't think there actually are 100, but something like that. But so, which means still open for Cincinnati to become one. So they drafted a series of recommendations. I'm only going to do the major points, bullet points on this, and there's a number of sub-points under each one, and then frame my first question around that. The first is to promote safe and resilient infrastructure. An example of that would be to create a national infrastructure bank that supports private-public investments in resilient infrastructure, including retrofits. Number two, big category, increase safe and healthy housing. As an example, expand low-income housing tax credits by at least 50%. The third big category, support the resilience of city economics. An example of that would be grow local economies through workforce training programs dedicated to promoting the nation's safety and resilience. And number five of the big categories is improve safety, public safety, and justice. An example of that would be support public health approach to reduce violence. So we've got these kind of big definitions of resilience. And I want to pose the first question to both Eric and to Grant. What does resilience mean for you? In other words, we understand the big systemic issue that's at stake here, but resilience is local. Everybody has their own local issues. We've all got the same systemic problems, essentially. And I've looked at your websites, and there's a lot of similarity between those. And if you go through the 100 cities, there's going to be a lot of consistency between all of the 98 or 100 cities that are listed there. But you in Louisville do not begin at the same point you in Pittsburgh do. We wouldn't begin at the same point we do in Cincinnati. So starting with you, Grant, what does resilience mean in Pittsburgh, and give me a couple of places where you're starting with your efforts to address this problem for your community?
Sure. Well, thank you, and thank you to Green Umbrella and all of you for giving us the opportunity to share an afternoon with you here in Cincinnati. And special thanks to my friend Larry Falcon and Oliver Kroner from the city of Cincinnati. Larry's actually one of my mentors in the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and it's great to see kind of your work here in your city to share that with you. Resilience is really kind of an interesting topic, and I think one of the things that we're encountering right now is I'm going to call we're encountering within cities is the age of the meta, meaning that we are at this point where we are dealing with major issues that are being thrust upon cities. So all of a sudden we have these new terminologies like sustainability, like equity, like resilience that are being thrust into the lexicon. And I always tell the story that my mom is really frustrated with me because she really wished I became a teacher or a dentist because she can't tell her friends what a chief resilience officer is. Why can't you
lie?
be
Just lie.
why can't you be something simple? And I went from the sustainability director to the chief resilience officer, and she just shook her head. But it does a couple of things, and the way that I like to think about it is resilience creates an entry point for a lot of people to have a deep and meaningful discussion. And what I mean by that is whether you are an electrical utility or a social service provider or in the community development world or a psychiatrist, you deal with the term of resilience in your own way. It's part of your own vocabulary. So as a result, then, it creates an entry point for a community conversation because everybody thinks they know what resilience means. And the challenge is that everybody has a different definition about it. It means something different in their own space. But at least it gets everybody around the table, which is kind of point number one. Point number two is one of the ways that we think about resilience is kind of in the space of continuous improvement. You're right, Jim, in that every city, every person, individual comes at a different starting point. But we all have the ability to continuously improve. And cities are in that same space. we use kind of the analogy of athletics, that on one side of the spectrum, you can have a power lifter who can hoist 400 pounds over their head. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have a marathoner who can run 26.2 miles. But those two athletes are kind of in isolation. Cities have to be dynamic and have to be somewhere in the middle where they can exalt strength as well as endurance. And resilience provides kind of that context for the conversation. One of the ways in which we kind of break that down, though, for us in Pittsburgh is something real simple. And you have to understand that we're the home of Mr. Rogers. And one of the things that we've realized is resilience is really about being a good neighbor. It's one of the cheapest and easiest impacts that we can have is to be able to have a conversation with your neighbor, to be able to lend a hand. Because it's at that fundamental level at which we're building human contact and human relations with one another that we can strengthen and build resilience. So for us, that's become the starting point of conversation. We entered the resilience dialogue through our partners at 100 Resilient Cities, thinking about infrastructure and catastrophe and all these dark things that could happen or do happen to cities. But at its core, the basis is, are we being a good neighbor? And can we build upon that?
Eric?
Very pleased to be here today. I would like to say what Grant said.
Catherine?
So Eric Friedlander, just from down the road. We are all connected by the Ohio River, which I think is nice. And for Louisville and for me, I look at resilience and I think of it as a Rorschach test, right? It is what you see in it. And so Grant comes from the sustainability background. My background is health and human services. So I'm kind of an odd bird in the 100 Resilient Cities Network, but I would absolutely agree what we talk about in Louisville, and our entry point really has to do with, those of you who know Louisville know that Mayor Fisher, my great Mayor Fisher, talks about compassion. And so our entry point has been through this community value of compassion. What does that mean? I mean, it's almost as bad as resilience. But it is an aspirational community value that we share and we get into conversation, and that brought us to a conversation about equity. And the reason that I was selected for this 100 Resilient Cities piece is because of my health and human services background. Louisville was looking at, we have so many issues with equity. We have so much historical baggage that we need to acknowledge and work through around structures, around institutional racism, that was something that we had to have a very honest discussion about. Because environmental justice, where we've located our chemical factories, and where the flooding from the Ohio River occurs, is just like everywhere. It is with the most vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable neighborhoods are the ones that will be most impacted. And you can see that across the world. So much like Eric said, where we've ended up, not Eric, Grant said Eric, there's Eric Cole in Nashville, and so I'm used to talking with Eric Cole, so I apologize, Grant.
No problem.
It's very similar. It's that human connection. Who's the first responder in a city? Well, it's your neighbor. Who are the first responders within that community? It's the folks that actually know each other and have a connection. That's the most powerful mark of resilience. And the way I talk about folks to help them understand resilience is I say we all have had setbacks in our life. If you have not, good for you. But most everybody has hit something that has been a shock in their life. A loss of a loved one, a loss of a job, a loss of a pet. But that you have to come back from. What are those qualities that help you come back? What are those qualities that help you begin to live your life again? That's the beginning of resilience. And that's where people have been able to connect with, what does that mean? And then now we have a world that we have to be concerned about with those same shocks. And how do we figure out how do we come back from that? So, sorry, that was longer.
That's
but-
fine. Catherine, turning to you, this question of equity, which I mentioned at the beginning was the theme for last year, it also runs through our new Green Cincinnati plan. And we've found it in formulating the Green Cincinnati plan to be the single most challenging part of the plan. We, in some senses, we know some things to do about it, but in another sense, we don't know what to do about it. So you can get neighbors talking, but can you get them talking about the marginalized? Can you get them talking about the people who are, you say we have the river in common, we also have the river problem in common, right? And it's those people that are in the floodplains and so forth. How do we get people to, how do we get people talking about those people who are the marginalized, whether it's in our communities or globally? You gave some examples of that this morning.
I think the most important thing to do is by making those people real. So often it's, out of sight, out of mind. We see the pictures, we watch the news reports, and we start to feel as if they aren't even necessarily real. And so some of the most effective things I've seen, and you, I would say, know more about this than I do, that is opportunities to bring people together, to partner. Opportunities between two schools partnering with each other, between neighborhoods or families or churches partnering with each other. Put people in situations where they can actually get to know other people who are very different from them and have those conversations together rather than about how to affect change.
Well, one of the things that we're going to try to do beginning in the fall is relative to the Green Cincinnati plan. We're hoping that Xavier will take on the mission of going into the distressed neighborhoods in Cincinnati and not going in there and saying, the Green Cincinnati plan is good, trust us, but going in and say, tell us about your lives, tell us about what your needs are, tell us about what's going on here. Here's what's going on with the Green Cincinnati plan. Let's see where there's integration. Let's see where there's this. So one of the things I noticed about both of your websites on the Resilient City is that you have a number of things in common. One of them that's top of both of your lists is aging infrastructure. Catherine mentioned this this morning as a key problem, and the other is the economic inequality. Those two are closely tied to each other. How do you address those two together in your city? And the question is, with whom? Who are the partners you bring into that conversation so that you begin to have an impact both upon the aging infrastructure in the communities that suffer from the most aging and deteriorating infrastructures? And Grant, if you'll start us.
Sure. One of the things, and I want to pick up on the idea of community dialogue, just given where we're at and to underscore how important that is. One of the things that was the keystone of the development of our plan, which is called 1PGH, is the name of the Pittsburgh's Resilience Strategy. But also, one of the things we did was we concurrently built our climate action plan at the same time as our resilience plan. And we used a format called deliberative democracy. Is anybody familiar with deliberative forums? And effectively what it is getting together around tables, round tables just like this, and talking with your neighbor. And you might have somebody that has a totally divergent viewpoint from you sit down next to you, and that's a good thing, because it might create a creative tension. It might put you in a space where you might be a little bit uncomfortable. But what ends up happening in that format is that commonality starts to arise out of those conversations. And one of the key things that came out of those dialogues was the identification of the issues that you just raised. So aging infrastructure and then the structural inequality issues that we are dealing with as a city. And what that enabled us to do was, one, identify that everybody was on the same page with what the issues were, but they weren't talking to one another. So with that, one of the things that we've been able to do is we've moved in towards implementation of our plan is to be able to connect resident organizations and workforce development organizations with the actual people who are investing in the infrastructure. connecting them with contractors and connecting them with the workforce training program so that those residents can be the ones that are building the green infrastructure or installing the solar panels in their own neighborhood. So the actual kind of building and constructing isn't somebody coming in from the outside of the community. It's the community themselves that are using their hands and their minds and their labor to build their own neighborhoods. Now, that's not an easy process, but it's the first step, though, is to identify connections of the needs with the ability to make those projects happen in real time.
Eric?
Also a great answer. And I will tell you, in Louisville, we're in a slightly different spot, not as advanced. I can tell you what doesn't work in Louisville, because I think we have examples of that, many examples of that, unfortunately. I'm in a different place on the resilience plan, which is we're just now beginning to develop our strategy, phase 2, which no one cares about.
We have our own 100 Resilient Cities language that we speak.
Yeah,
so.
sorry, inside baseball.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of failures around that. We have had some potential investment in more vulnerable neighborhoods that was not connected to the neighborhood, that was not connected to the community, and failed. Mm-hmm. We currently have I hear MSD and I think Louisville. So, but we have an MSD project with aging, crumbling infrastructure. We were an early builder of a lot of big sewers and all sorts of things like that. And just 2 days ago, we had a fire in our Center for the Arts. And we couldn't park the fire engines on the south side of the street because we have a 25-foot sewer line that is in imminent danger of collapse. And our Metro Council refuses to pass any rate increase above what is base. So we have a disconnect within community, within the political realm, within the social realm, where we have not, we'll get to it a little later, but you'll see we have these very pretty diagrams that look like spider webs, but there's no connection in Louisville between really the green infrastructure and the economy. It's missing. Mm-hmm. So my challenge is going to be how to have those discussions and how to make the connections within a community where we will have these roundtables and have the discussion where we identify what is common. We have a tree planting. I'll cut short. We have a tree planting piece that failed because we didn't have the conversation. So those conversations are absolutely critical to be able to move this kind of work forward. And unfortunately, I think Louisville has as many negative examples as positive.
And so the failures that you talked about, the tree planting, but you talked about other community development infrastructure things. Give me a specific example of a failure. I think learning from where other people have tried things and they have not worked is always instructive for those of us who are moving into these processes.
I'll give you a failure and then how it turned into a success.
Good.
Can I do that?
Yeah.
So 2 years ago, our sustainability plan identified that Louisville is one of the fastest growing heat islands in the country, in an urban area. And I told you we had some very, very frank equity discussions. I can take, and if you come later, I can take a redlining map from the 30s and overlay a tree canopy map, and it is amazingly similar. So trying to pass a tree ordinance, get some funding to plant trees, and the pushback came from the council members who were representing the districts that had the least tree canopy, because no one had actually gone into the community to discuss it. And the feedback that the council members were getting initially had to do with, well, don't plant a tree in front of my yard. I'm having enough trouble with codes and regs. And then the tree limb's going to fall on my house. And are you going to help me pay for that? Are you going to help pay for the tree? That's an expense. Why are you putting something that's going to cost me in front? So we hadn't done the explanation with the community. We had not had those discussions. A year later, after going through some of the, well, here's the redlining map, and here's the tree canopy map, and here's the heat island map, and this is why this is important, and engaging and being more intentional about engaging community, this last budget, it passed. But by assuming we had the answer and going in with a plan before having the discussion with the community, that was the failure. When we changed how we did that, then it turned into a success. But we couldn't do it without that kind of discussion.
Catherine, as you look at this more globally and in a variety of localities, one of the things that we're aware of is that as this discussion began with the Earth Summit back in the late 80s and early 90s, the whole point of that was that we were dealing with the environment over here and poverty over here, and they're one systemic problem that we need to deal with in that way. And somehow, in all those intervening years, it's drifted apart again, that conversation, we've got the environmental movement, which has become a middle class and upper middle class movement, and then we've got the neighborhood development and equity people over here who say we don't have time to worry about the environment because we've got too many. Do you see that pattern changing at all? And if not, what strategies can we employ to change that pattern? Because that's the critical one, or it seems to me to be one of the critical ones we need to change.
Oh, yes. I absolutely see this pattern, and it's a very dangerous one because it allows us to say, I'm not that type of person. So when we say climate change is an environmental issue, and I myself thought of climate change as an environmental issue until I took my first class in climate science, which was kind of accidental. I needed one more credit to graduate. And I wasn't too interested in geology, so there was a climate science class. I took it. It wasn't until then that the light bulb went off in my head, and I realized that climate change is, as the military now calls it, and I think this is the best description of climate change I've ever heard, climate change is a threat multiplier. Climate change takes whatever threat we are already facing and multiplies it. So the Army looks at it from the perspective of national security. Climate change multiplies national security concerns. We look at it from the perspective of humanitarian issues. Poverty, hunger, lack of access to clean water, which kills millions of people a year, disease, pollution. It's an economic issue. It's a jobs issue. It's a health issue. It is not just an environmental issue. And in fact, really, what is an environmental issue other than an issue to do with our surroundings that affects something that we care about? Why is it dangerous to paint climate change or sustainability as an environmental issue? It's because for many people, they have a stereotype of what an environmentalist is. An environmentalist is, if I still had my polling, I'd let you guys fill in the blank. Let me put in a couple of things I've heard. You know, an environmentalist is somebody who's green, who hugs trees, bikes to work, wears Birkenstocks, eats granola, doesn't shower enough. And there's many people, in fact, the vast majority of people in the United States would not call themselves an environmentalist. So if we paint these issues as environmental issues, immediately we're giving people permission to check out because that's not who I am. The reality is that climate change and environmental stresses and hunger and poverty and all those other things, they're human issues. And the last I checked, most of us are humans. No, don't name any exceptions. If we're human, then we automatically care. And so coming from it from this perspective is such a tremendous difference than coming at it from a perspective where immediately most of people say, I don't really care about it. So next time you're thinking about something, you're thinking about how to communicate it, think of it as it's a human issue. And everybody I'm talking to is human. It just makes sense for them to care about it. Again, as I said, our only job is to connect the dots for them. It's not to change who they are or what they care about. It's simply to show them how it connects to what they already care about because they are a human living in this place with these shared concerns. As you said, you found out everybody cared about the same things, which is actually amazing.
So picking up on that and coming to you then, so we need conversations. But then are those conversations between? You've talked about those in Louisville, in Pittsburgh and in Louisville. Is that between the government and these neighbors, or is it between middle-class neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods? Because the question is, you can say we're all neighbors, but we're also all very tribal. And our neighborhoods are very tribal neighborhoods. I talk to the people in my neighborhood, but my neighborhood does not go wandering down to Over the Rhine to have a conversation with people in Over the Rhine about the common questions. So where are those conversations being fostered? Is it at the government level? How do you expand this concept or this notion of what constitutes not just a neighborhood, but a community of neighborhoods, so that the common good transcends the local individual good? Why don't you start us, Eric, this time, so this way you don't get to say, I agree with Grant.
Dang it. Dang it. What I'll say to you is if it's at the government level, it will be a failure. If that's all it is, it cannot work and will not work. Where it has been most successful in Louisville is that community organizations in some ways have taken the lead. We can sponsor in government, we can sponsor a conversation, we can participate in the conversation, but if we are leading all the conversations, they will not succeed. So we have organizations that really begin to sponsor some of the conversations between the neighborhoods that don't talk to each other, right? So those organizations and those community organizations that can bring Center for Neighborhoods in Louisville, and there are many others I could name, but that sponsor those conversations that are not simply about, we're going to talk about what the government wants to tell you today. We're going to talk about, and we're going to read books together, and we are going to meet at different neighborhoods to make sure we're getting all around the city. Those are as powerful, those organizations are as powerful, if not more powerful, than anything the government could do on its own. I've worked for government for 30 years. I know that there is a great role for government, but really making individuals, making outreach to individuals, meeting people exactly where they are, that's not our strength. But our strength is oftentimes convening conversations, supporting community conversations, and being a part of those. When we do that, that's what makes the difference in our communities.
And Grant, I'm assuming you agree with everything Eric said.
You just took my line. I was going to say I agree with Eric. One of the things I've tried to do a lot of deep thinking on this recently, and traveling here from Pittsburgh across the great state of Ohio, it kind of reminds you about the places in between. And might be a little history lesson, a little mea culpa. So like my background for 10 years, I was the director of an organization called 10,000 Friends of Pennsylvania, which is effectively Pennsylvania's sustainable development organization. So I worked in 67 counties, 2,600 municipalities all across the great state of Pennsylvania. And the one common thing that I could tell you about that is that everyone loves their community. It's a common bond that you have whether you're in a city or in a township or a small village or a borough. Everyone loves where they live. And that's something that's always stuck with me. And over the past 5 years, I've worked for the city of Pittsburgh, and I've been engaged in what I think is one of the most dynamic dialogues of our time, which is city-to-city connections, which is because of what I'm going to call the dereliction of federal and state government in terms of taking responsibility, not just with the issues of climate change, but of investing in ourselves. So you talked about the aging infrastructure issue. Our infrastructure is a reflection of us. So whenever you drive down the road and you hit a pothole, or the bridge hasn't been painted, or the sewer system isn't fixed, or the power goes out, that's a reflection of us. And we've had this opportunity in my role to see other places and see other cities. And it's those cities that invest in themselves where you see the people who are the happiest. If you go to a place like Copenhagen, Denmark, which is always ranked as one of the most sustainable and happiest places on earth, even though it's dark half the time, they have a thing that they call hygge. Has anybody ever heard of hygge? I love it. You guys are my friends. So hygge is this idea of coziness. And it's the idea of warmth and connection between the people that you are sharing your place with. It could be a table, it could be a cup of coffee, it could be a little nook in your house, that's hygge. But the Danes have created places within their cities that foster those connections with their neighbors, right? And that's a thing where we're missing that in America right now. Because, to your question, we're not talking to one another. We're only talking to people within our tribes, and we sure as hell aren't talking to the people that are in between. And one of the things that I would ask everyone to do is to get out of your comfort zone and to go someplace where you haven't been. That could be the next neighborhood over, or it could be someplace between here in Pittsburgh or here in Louisville. And just talk to somebody. And what you're going to find is that you have something in common with them. And it's that ability to have that dialogue and that connection, I think, that will allow us to start to break down some of these barriers.
And I want to go back to that, which is to say, yes, I agree in principle and in theory with all this. But I also am a realist. I know that the people in a middle class or upper middle class neighborhood, most of them are not particularly disposed to going into the more distressed neighborhoods and having a conversation. A lot of the people in those distressed neighborhoods are not going to trust the people who come from those neighborhoods to have a conversation with them. And so what strategies do you use to convince them to say, what we have in common is Cincinnati. And we have common issues, and somehow my problems are not just my problems, but my problems, your problems are my problems as well.
Right.
What strategies would work to get people to see that? I mean, one of the things we try to do is work through faith communities, because we think that's a powerful engine and can be a powerful engine. In fact, next Sunday, a week from Sunday, right here, we'll be doing a festival of faiths of 12 faith traditions. We're taking over the whole building and celebrating not only the fact that all of us exist as this diverse community, but we're all doing community engagement together. That's what we're focused on. It's called compassion through action. We look at that as a motivator. Is that a strategy? And what other ones might work?
There's many of them, but I think the key is really facilitation. So when you said, take a trip somewhere and start a conversation, that's, I'm a pretty outgoing person, but I find it challenging to just start a random conversation with somebody because I'm going to think they think I'm crazy. I can remember the last conversation I had with somebody I didn't know, and it was I walked up to the line to get a coffee, and the woman in front of me was wearing the exact same sweater that I had on. So I said to her, "Oh, we have the same sweater." But I mean, that's the type of thing it took for me to actually start up a random conversation with somebody. And what are the chances of that, right? So, but facilitation, when there's an organization which can be government, as you pointed out, that's a very important role for local government. It can be faith communities, it can be academic communities or nonprofit communities that facilitate something that has a purpose. So you sit down at a table and you actually have things to talk about. You have little almost, you can make it fun games to exchange information. There's a purpose and a structure, and that is where we start to get the info, because if we do not have some type of structure to facilitate, to make people feel purposeful, to make them feel that what they have to say matters, the only voices we're going to hear from are the loudest voices. And the loudest voices represent a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. And frankly, at least in my experience, often some of the loudest voices are the least helpful ones. So facilitation, I think, is just absolutely critical. Would you guys agree from your experience?
Absolutely. One of the threads that I really like that you have going on here is around food system. There are a lot of really excellent examples around common table, yes, shared food, shared understanding of food. Talking to farmers, local vor, those pieces, they're things that everybody can relate to. So finding those ways that you work on systems and food systems, and then ways to bring folks together around those food systems, that's a very powerful way to think about organizing a conversation as well. it has all the elements of equity and justice and environment. I went to Antioch College, so you know I'm into the Birkenstocks and not showering as often.
No judgment, no
He,
judgment.
he has actually hugged a tree.
But it's those kinds of things where you can find, because to me, one of the best definitions of resilience also has to do with the intersectionality of everything. And when you realize and can articulate that around a table, that is a very powerful moment for folks to understand that they are perhaps outside of their comfort zone and community and tribe, but that there's a broader tribe.
So is the job of a resilience officer then to foster that facilitation? Is that what your job is? I mean, what does your job look like in a day, in a week? I mean, what do you actually do? I'm with your mother. I have no idea.
If you saw my office, it would be like just a wall of Post-it notes with stuff on it, and whiteboards and charts. One of the key roles, and this is a kind of a discovery process, I think, too, is really to be the integrator. One of the things that I think is fascinating about being in the Chief Resilience Officer position is that you are at the intersection of so many different issues. So I can tell you all you want to know about Pittsburgh's energy grid, but at the same time, I could talk about homelessness, I could talk to you about food systems, because it requires the ability to understand how these systems integrate with one another. And once you have that understanding, then it becomes to be the role of the facilitator to say, it'd be really great if you had a conversation with so-and-so, or to connect the dots between this issue and that issue. Because typically what happens is when you're in your own vertical, you have a difficult time seeing out beyond that. So our role is really to work across the top of an organization or across the top of a city to really understand how systems come together. One of to talk in 100 Resilient City jargon, one of the things that we discuss a lot is the concept of the resilience dividend. And this is something that Judith Roden, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, brought to the table, which is when you go into an activity, you're not looking for a singular solution, but you're looking for multi-attributional outcomes. So it's not just that we need to replace a bridge, but how can we also incorporate bike lanes and make sure that we're managing stormwater better? And smart city technology, we can incorporate broadband across that bridge. And use community design and art to bring kind of connection to the neighborhood in which that bridge exists. So this idea of taking on activities not in isolation, but the idea that you can create multiple benefits out of a single activity.
Catherine, I think you had a question. Did you have a question? No?
No, I was just going to highlight the idea you brought up there, which is facilitating opportunities so people don't have to create them themselves, but you're facilitating them, but making them something that people want, that they would be excited about showing up for. So you're not, being forced, your arm twisted into talking about some boring set of questions. There's this really cool, local harvest dinner, and you can sign up here, and who knows who you're going to sit beside. Wow, I want to do that. And you guys are already doing that. I want to paddle down the river. Everybody's paddling down the river together. Where I come from in Toronto, they have this annual knit-along every summer where you get in these streetcars and you go from knitting place to knitting place, and everybody on that streetcar is knitting. And it's really cool and really fun. Well, it builds a tremendous sense of community, and you meet all kinds of people you never met before, but it's something that actually makes people feel even more of who they are. And so if I had to summarize the primary goal with affecting change, that is that you want to show people that change makes them even more of who they already are. It fills out, it builds, it expands, it enhances their identity that they already have and that they already esteem. And that is what building a sense of community does, right?
There's this idea of moving out of your comfort zone is a particularly challenging one. We obviously it's uncomfortable, but when we try to facilitate those kinds of conversations, one of the things that I've noticed, and I've been doing this work for a long time, is that they often have a great beginning, but they're very difficult to sustain. So how do you sustain this? I mean, you both of you are fortunate in that you've got a Rockefeller grant. You've got some money behind you for whatever period of that $1 million, however long that lasts. How is this going to be sustained? And how, that's the financial sustaining part, but how do you sustain those contacts past the initial facilitation? Either one.
Well, we won't fight. Okay. He'll have the better answer. But how we're looking at it in Louisville is, and I think it would be the same for any community. What's already going on that you're trying to plug into? Mm-hmm. And then how do you figure out that, like, I worked for government for 30 years. I know some of the reason people work for government is because we like things to stay the same. And it's a bureaucrat's disease. I was there for 30 years. I know this is true. So part of what you try to do is make something structural. So within Louisville, the mayor talks about the Louis stat, where we are weakness oriented, and we try to measure and make data driven decisions. So part of the discovery areas are going to be, how do we have essentially community stat? What data are we looking at around equity? Around sustainability that we can all agree on as a community, and that then we measure how we make progress against that. So it's not just, oh, you can point the finger at the government for not doing it. I love what you said about, when you hit the pothole, we better be pointing the fingers back at ourselves. So how can we own that as a community? How can we take full sponsorship of that so that we understand that when we haven't been able to deal with the homeless encampment and provide services in the way that we should, that we need to point everywhere. And if we want to have that impact, it is to make that structural so that when we bureaucrats get a hold of it in 3 years, that it is, oh no, this is the way we do it. We use a racial equity tool. We use a resilience tool in any decision that's what we do. So it is making that a part of how we function. Easier said than done, but I really believe that by hooking into existing, like in Louisville, the compassion piece, hooking into existing pieces where the conversation is ripe. Mm-hmm. That's how you build it into a sustainable structure, because then it's something that we all own together.
One of the things, just a couple quick points, I guess. One is that the process that we're going through right now in terms of resilience planning is different. And it's different because traditional community planning processes are asset-based. What are the things that are good about our community, and how are we going to make them better? What the planning process that we're involved in is a little different in that it's looking at what I call the 7 a.m. look in the mirror. You wake up and you look in your mirror and you're like, oh God, what happened last night?
What do you do at night?
That's another story. But you wake up and you're like, man, you got to spruce up, right? And what we do is we're taking an approach by looking at our stresses and shocks. So James talked a little bit about this earlier this morning, where shocks are those immediate negative impacts that that your community has the propensity to experience. It could be a hurricane, an earthquake, a flood. Those stressors or stresses are the issues of the slow burns, the issues that we deal with every day. It might be poor air quality or poor water quality that we know that it's a problem, but I'm getting by. I'm going to get through my day today. And it's by understanding what those issues and challenges are and forcing yourself as a community to confront them is very difficult, because you're asking very uncomfortable questions. In terms of sustainability, one of the things that we recognize within our strategy that was a stressor, Pittsburgh, like Louisville, Cincinnati, I will go to the table to imagine that our cities are stress-based. the chances of us experiencing an earthquake or a hurricane are slim to none in the context of a Hurricane Sandy or Katrina or Northridge earthquake or whatever the expense may be. So we're dealing with these stresses every day. And one of the challenges that we have with our stressors was fragmentation, both in terms of local government, intersector, public, private, nonprofit, philanthropy, where everybody's doing great things but going in different directions. So one of the ways that we're looking to address that in terms of sustainability of the One PGH plan is to create what we're calling a social impact fund. No, nothing is a better way than to bring money together in an unfragmented way towards common purposes. So leveraging public resources that we have at the city, that we're spending $600–700 million every year in operations and capital infrastructure, how do we start to bring our partners in philanthropy, in higher education, in the private sector to align their capital resources to make the investments that we need in order to advance and build a more resilient
Is
city?
the social impact fund private, public, or is it public, or what's the source?
We're in the design process right now.
Okay.
So this is kind of that conversation, that facilitated conversation between investors in the public sector, in philanthropy, and specifically in higher education, hospitals, and universities. So one of the biggest challenges that we've had in Pittsburgh is that 40% of our tax base is not taxed because they're nonprofit hospitals and higher institution educations. So right off the bat, and I love people that say government should be run like a business, because right off the bat, almost half of our revenue is like that. Now, these institutions provide great value, and they provide a lot of capital investments, but how do we do it so that we're all rowing the boat in the same direction in order to achieve outcomes around affordable housing, around pre-kindergarten services, around green infrastructure, around purchasing renewable energy? Because in effect, they're all procurement decisions at the end of the day.
Well,
And it's just putting our money where our mouth is.
Given your roles in this and the private, public, and how we do neighborhood economic development in this country and in this city, is we basically do it through gentrification. How do we do more equitable neighborhood development? And as we're doing more equitable neighborhood development, how do we ask one more question to that? How do we do it in an environmentally sustainable way? I mean, for me, that encapsulates the problem. It's an infrastructure problem. It's an equity problem. On both of your lists, it hits so many of those things. But how do you stop developers from coming in and saying, we're now colonizing this neighborhood, and we're not doing fair housing, we're not doing mixed income housing, we're literally chasing people out? Catherine.
I could offer just a brief thought, and that is the fact that not always, but often, lower income neighborhoods are lower income because of a reason. So, for example, in Houston, many of the lower income neighborhoods are the ones that flood first. In many other big cities across the Southeast, many of the lower income neighborhoods are the ones that are near the coal plants or the other types of industry that have a massive polluting impact on the nearby neighborhood, with birth defects, cancer rates, even deaths. So there's often exacerbating factors. So if you moved in and you put lipstick on the pig, so to speak, that's actually not going to fix the problem. Perhaps the biggest thing you could do for the neighborhood would be to shut down the coal plant, as opposed to doing any other program for the neighborhood. But then once you start something like that, and I'm thinking of a specific example in Alabama, that Jeff Sessions got caught up in, then the big money comes into play, and there's a lot of politics, a lot of money to keep stuff open that you're actually fighting against. And so it's I'm not offering a solution to this. I'm just raising the level of awareness that isn't just that you have a neutral neighborhood that has problems. You have factors that are actively acting to degrade the quality of life and health in that neighborhood, and who are often opposed to changing that.
Wow. There is no the answer at all. And so understanding historical context, I know I've said redlining, understanding urban renewal, understanding historic disinvestment in neighborhoods. In Louisville, For those of you who would love to come, we call it a 9th Street Divide. It was designed during urban renewal. It separates downtown from the west end of Louisville. It is very clear, very architectural, very well planned to separate the west end of the city from downtown. Urban renewal tore down many, many businesses that were owned by African Americans, and the stated purpose was to bring more white people downtown Louisville. Well, guess what happened? That's when Louisville's population plateaued. Coincide, not the flood, not the 37 flood, but the disaster we put upon the people of Louisville. So how do you acknowledge that? We're clearly we're trying. But then it is also, how do you do investment? Because you have historic differences in wealth, in education, in life outcomes. Come this afternoon, you'll see my slides. So it will take intentional policy. How do you support home ownership, business ownership? I loved where I was this morning around essentially a company doing an employee buyback. What are those co-ops? How do you build ownership so that as property increases in value, it accrues to the people who've been living there for the past 50 years? And that takes intentionality. It takes being uncomfortable with that intentionality, but being committed to it. And there are many different ways to approach that. And I absolutely agree. How we deal with environmental issues and the fact that most of where we have we're old tobacco warehouses, right? The Black Flag property, which is an insecticide section. Those are all pieces that have to be discussed. And why were they there? But you have to address that.
I want to be cognizant of time. How long do we have left?
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, and I want to allow some time for questions and answers there, or to let you all get involved in this. There's a microphone here, so please come to the microphone. And while you're doing that, just one final question for both of you. One of the things that's critical to the resilience programs, as Rockefeller and others conceive it, is public-private partnerships. Who are your major partners, and how did you recruit them?
So I'm going to pick up on the last one, and then I'll lead into that real quick. You used a great word of intentionality, and one of the things in Pittsburgh, part of that intentionality I think has to be historical context. And both that and we use the word gentrification. I think part of that historical context is about, in our case, and I would presume in here in Cincinnati and in Louisville as well, has been population loss. So we are a city of 305,000 people, down from 600,000 people. So technically, until you get over 600,000 persons, we're not gentrifying, because we have lost the gentry, right? And that has implications on infrastructure. We have just recently left Act 47, which is the state of Pennsylvania's designation of fiscal distress, which is actually bankruptcy, because we lost our tax base. We lost the ability to pay for the operations of local government. Now, that's not to say that there are not places in Pittsburgh that are not gentrifying. In my neighborhood, there's a bus stop that on top of that bus stop, it says, "Fuck Google." Now think about that. And I have to.
Is that an ad?
It is. It is an ad. And it's an ad from the historical context of why are you here in my neighborhood, right? And that, going back to my point about having those intentional conversations, those Googlers are not having conversations with the residents, which creates resentment. We've just gone through a very intentional community planning process around a bus rapid transit program. For 35 years in Pittsburgh, there has been the desire to connect downtown Pittsburgh with Oakland. And this is the second and third largest commercial centers in the state of Pennsylvania behind Center City, Philadelphia. And every civic leader said we need to have an LRT or a BRT and connect, and the residents hated it. Hated it. You're going to make a $300 million investment in my neighborhood. Why?
Same here.
And what we did, though, was we flipped the conversation from having the neighborhood of Uptown being a place that you go through to being a place that you go to. And all of a sudden, that has changed the relationship with the neighborhood to turn what was viewed as a detriment to being an asset, because we talk to people intentionally. And what that has done in terms of the partnerships, though, is started to leverage private investment and other additional ancillary public investment in different ways, because we're starting to think about it in a more creative way. And it starts to open up the door in a transparent way in terms of what's going on here. It's no longer being a backroom deal, but it's viewed now as an opportunity. Does that make any of the tensions less? Certainly not. We still have tough conversations, but we have a table now in which to do it.
And Eric, quickly on partnerships, and then we got some questions.
Well, you really just described them, right? We've been talking about it the whole time, around philanthropy, around business, neighborhoods and community leaders, and identifying those people within communities that are the ambassadors for their communities, that are the hubs of the conversations, and making sure that they are all a part of the conversations. You said it so well, and identifying those pieces where we're all going to put the oar in the water together. In Louisville, it's going to be around education. It's very intentional about secondary education. So we're all going to invest, and we're going to head in this similar direction. So you have to have those conversations and commitments to sharing data. That's not terribly sexy, but
important.
Absolutely.
Oh, it is for
critical.
scientists.
I don't know.
Oh, yes.
That is not bad. So let me go to a question, and just so everybody knows, there will be a panel on resilience right after this upstairs. So if you want to continue and go into some more depth with these two gentlemen, they will be upstairs later. So first question back here, Brewster.
Sorry, I can't reach us. First of all, it's nice to have fellow River cities represented here, so thank you very much. We all do a paddle from Pittsburgh down to Louisville.
Yeah.
We can stop and have some beers here in Cincinnati, okay? I am very, and I appreciate the plug for paddling in the Ohio. We have our great annual Paddle Fest here. I invite you to come back. It's the 4th of August, so join us. A little plug, okay? But I also would like to have understand a little bit from you two as resilience or sustainability officers. To what extent do you currently work with your civic leadership, your mayor, your city council, your state reps, state senators, to advocate for policy and funding changes at the state level and also the national level? We've been focusing on what can be done locally with resources that we locally control. But we're operating at a state and national political environment, frankly, that is going the opposite direction in, I would argue, our 3 states. Yep. That is not being helpful to the aggressive agendas that we have in each of our metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's the easy question. I would say this. So for the first, we're in my Mayor Peduto is in his 2nd term, so this is kind of round 2 for us. And a large piece of our focus was on what can we do within the city of Pittsburgh in terms of our jurisdiction. So understanding kind of the rules of the state and those sorts of things. So a lot of our efforts, particularly in our climate plan and the resilience strategy, are based on the tools that we have within our toolbox. That said, we are now kind of at that point where we got to talk to the guys in Harrisburg. And it is the guys. And that's part of the problem. And the thing about it is that we've been very strategic about what those issues are. So, for example, we recently passed the PACE legislation and also modernized our building codes, which was something that was a big challenge. And part of that, the way that we have done that, has been partnered with other cities. So predominantly in our case, Philadelphia has been a keen partner of ours in a lot of our climate-related activities. At the federal level, it's a little different story. We had negotiated a memorandum of understanding with U.S. Department of Energy back in 2014, 2015 around district energy and microgrid technology, which is something that we're really at the epicenter of building and advancing. We have not had a similar type of engagement with the current administration. So what we did was we created a memorandum of understanding with the Danish government. So since our federal government didn't want to work with us, we worked with somebody else. And they were more than happy.
Was it cozy?
It was cozy. It is a cozy relationship. In fact, they're coming to town on Monday. So, which is actually has helped us further both our technical work in terms of kind of that you talked about partnerships, really getting both our utilities and universities and engineering firms and some of the mechanical providers and things like that on board has really helped further that. So that's how we've done it.
I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer a different question. Good politician, right?
That's slick.
But I want to answer it because you actually asked it earlier. Where do we get hope, right? I was in Health and Human Services in Kentucky. We rolled out Connect. We expanded Medicaid. We did a lot of really, really great things that are now going in the opposite direction. So I've struggled with that question. And here is my best answer to your question. Because really it is about where do I find hope with the state and national government, which I don't find much. But it actually makes the work that you're doing locally all that more important.
Yeah.
When I was in Atlanta the day after, let's say, the presidential election, and was not at a racial equity conference. And what was very powerful to me, and what helped me on that day, and I hope is helpful to everybody here, is the work that you're doing here and today, when the tide is against you, is all that more important. You have to do this work now. You have to continue to have, and right now the progressive work is on the local level and among cities.
It is.
And we have to work there now. We have to work there now. And the work that we do here now is going to carry us forward when the tide shifts.
So next question.
Good answer.
Dr. Hayhoe, thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Half of my family is from West Texas. The other half is from a Pacific Island nation that is predicted to disappear within the next 10 to 20 years.
That is quite the combination.
I've traveled the world doing lectures, doing keynotes about the human faces of climate change. And my family always says to tell people that we are afraid, to tell the people that we don't know the science or the politics behind climate change. But we know what's happening in our own backyard. Some of my family members believe that God made Noah a promise. Some of us are a bit more skeptical of that promise. They want me to say we don't want to leave. We've never wanted to leave our islands. To us, in the Catholic institution, the islands are like a holy trinity. Abba means land, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, land, country, and people, all connected through Abba. We're born on our land, we live our lives on that land. When we die, we return to that land to join our ancestors above and watch over future generations. So people and land are connected. That's not something that I find here. And it seems to me that science has dictated most of the conversation over climate change for way too long. Polar bears are known. Kiribati, Maldives, and Marshallese, Tokelau, Tuvaluans are not known. How can we help voice our words from the front lines? Because what we are experiencing is an ecological genocide. The people are the land, and the land are the people. We may be the first to leave this earth, but we will not be the last. How do we voice our perspectives for the world to hear?
That is a great question. I would just say you are not unknown. The second picture I showed after the polar bear?
Yeah,
Yes,
Tuvalu.
exactly, yes. First of all, let me respond to something you said, as well as about the dozen questions that I got from individual people after my previous presentation. I would say that just about everybody who asked me a question afterwards, the question was, how can I get more information about how do I talk to people? I have somebody I want to talk to. I want to tell them that this thing really is real, it's not a natural cycle, there are solutions, we need to act. How do I tell them that? Our Global Weirding series answers that question, yes. Our Global Weirding series you can find on YouTube, just Google Global Weirding. And there's, my favorite episode is, if I just tell them the facts, they'll change their mind, right? And the answer, of course, is wrong. There's also, actually, our most popular episode. I didn't know which episode people were going to like the most. Our most popular episode is, the Bible doesn't talk about climate change, does it? And in that one, it specifically addresses common myths, like, God promised Noah he would never again flood the earth. Well, nobody's saying the whole earth will be underwater, but we are saying large parts of it will be, and that's not the same thing. So if you're looking for more, if you have more questions, check out the Global Weirding series, and also check out my website, which is just my name, CatherineHayhoe.com. I have a lot of material posted there. This relates directly to your question, how do we get the word out? Now, there have been some very effective programs where organizations, especially Christian organizations, like the Evangelical Environmental Network, they have brought people, they have brought witnesses, because the concept of witness is a very Christian concept. They have brought witnesses from countries like Malawi, from South Pacific Islands, and they have taken witnesses to various churches around the country to put that human face on it. When I go to a lot of international meetings, there is always a very strong presence there of witnesses from Pacific Islands. But how can you get the word out more effectively? Honestly, I think we live in a very unusual era where we have this internet thing, we have these social medias that are tools. They're not inherently good or evil, they can be used. We see a lot about how they're used for evil, for bad, but we can use them for good too. And so my personal goal, how I try to be most effective with what I have to say, living in a little corner of West Texas, which is 5 hours away from anything. I realize it's not quite as remote as Kiribati, but it is fairly remote, speaking in terms of the US. I use the internet to get that word out. There are so many different ways to do it. People make videos, they blog, they put pictures on Instagram, they track their journey, they document their life, they share art that they have created with people. There's poets, there's writers, there's photographers, there's people who visually present what their life looks like and how it's being affected by climate change. We have ways to share our lives today that we did not have 20 or 30 years ago, and that, in my experience at least, is one of the best ways we can take advantage of the world we live in. So, thank you.
I'll let Grant respond, but just one thing. One of our local documentary makers, Andrea Torreche, made a documentary almost 15 years ago called Rising Waters, which was exactly about the fate of the Pacific Islands. And it was prescient at the time. It's still relevant now. One of our research students has gone to Kiribati and lived, which you know, Abigail, went and studied that. And it's a very complex issue because there's no such category as an environmental refugee. And so we have nothing to do with what is an inevitable fate for these islands. I don't think it can be stopped at this point, and it's one of the great tragedies that we as a planet have refused to face and take on, because it's your point that you made earlier. It's not us. Somehow it's just not us. We're in the blue. And said, Grant, comment.
Yeah, just one of the things too. Actually, I didn't know you were going to say that, but I worked with Andrea Torrice, and we did 15 screenings of The New Metropolis, which is also a very powerful film series. But one of the things I want to make a pitch to everyone, actually, and there's a great piece of public art in Louisville, in the park down by the river, which demonstrates this, which is the river runs through it. We all share the common river. We've mentioned this today in the Ohio River. And whether you're starting in Pittsburgh or traveling through Ohio and Kentucky, that commonality is a common thread that binds us all together. And the U.S. Army Corps has actually done some really good work about the implications of climate change on the river in terms of the life. And my point is that, if we can, it's to bring the story home in terms of making that connection and those common connections, that this isn't just a global issue, but it's also a local issue. And to create those common threads with other places around the world is pretty strong and powerful.
Well, let me thank both Eric and Grant for being here, and also to Catherine for all day. She's blasting off right now. She's catching an Uber to the airport to catch a plane to go do a Father's Day celebration with her family. So I want to thank all of you for that, and help me thanking them for this. Just a reminder, there are sessions upstairs. There's a 15-minute break, or?
I have, do you mind if I still, thank you. Just to transition